From the ancient tribes forging a nation in fire and ice, to the iron will of czars shaping an empire, Russia's story is one of relentless ambition.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into the incredibly vast and complex history of Russia. We've got a lot of material here, research, notes, analyses covering, well, basically everything from the earliest settlements right up to today. Our goal is to really pull out the key insights, look for those recurring themes, and pinpoint the big shifts that change the direction of things.
That's right. And what's really fascinating, I think, is seeing how things like geography, external pressures, and internal choices, how they all interact to create this unique historical path. It's marked by, well, both remarkable continuity in some ways and these moments of really profound upheaval. Looking at the material, we can trace those foundations and see how they still resonate.
Okay, sounds good. I'm ready to get started. Where do we even begin with this massive story based on the information we have?
Well, you almost have to start with the land itself. The material really emphasizes that Russia's geography isn't just a setting, it's like a fundamental force in the story. We're talking immense size, these vast plains stretching out huge river systems, the Volga, Don, Dnieper, which were, crucial early routes for trade and movement.
Right, early highways, basically. And the climate, famously harsh.
Oh, definitely. That continental climate, the severe winters, general winter, as it's sometimes called, it's acted as a natural defense. Think Napoleon, think Hitler. But it also poses huge challenges. It limits agriculture, shapes settlement patterns, requires incredible resilience. The sources mention key zones, tundra up north, taiga forest belt, think timber, furs, big early wealth source, and then the steppe to the south.
The steppe, yeah, that fertile black earth. But you also said it was kind of an open door for invaders.
Yeah, exactly. It's that duality, opportunity, and vulnerability. It's where settled populations constantly interacted with nomadic groups. And this whole geography, this vastness with resources spread out, it sort of pushes towards expansion, doesn't it? Seeking resources, warm water ports, more farmland.
And making defense a constant challenge.
A huge ongoing theme. Managing and defending this enormous, often exposed territory.
So long before states formed, what did the human picture look like on this land?
Well, the evidence goes back incredibly far. We're talking 1.5 million years in the North Caucasus, and Homo sapiens were in Arctic Siberia, adapting to extreme cold, hunting mammoths, maybe 40,000 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and places like Sungir from the Upper Paleolithic even suggest some kind of social complexity, maybe stratification among hunter-gatherers way back then.
So diverse groups adapting, but mostly tribal or clan-based.
Pretty much. You had Finno-Ugric peoples, Turkic nomads, the Scythians and Sarmatians on the separate, distinct cultures, languages. Governance was likely decentralized based on kinship, community decisions, that sort of thing.
Okay, and then the shift towards a more organized state happens, according to the material, around the late 9th century with Kievan Rus's.
Yes, that's generally seen as the starting point for Russian state history. Now, the role of the Varangians as Scandinavian Norsemen, it's debated, the whole Normanist theory.
Right. Were they invited in? Did they conquer?
Exactly. But figures like Rurik are foundational. And then Oleg, he's really key. He captured Kiev around 882.
Uniting Novgorod in the north with Kiev in the south.
Right, creating this vital political and trade axis, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, linking the Baltic Sea down to Byzantium. His successors like Igor expanded, and Princess Olga brought in administrative reforms like fixed tribute points.
And Olga also converted to Christianity personally, right? Though not for the whole state yet.
Correct. A significant personal step, but the really pivotal moment for the whole state comes with Vladimir the Great.
That feels like a massive turning point, the Christianization in 988 AD.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. Vladimir consolidates his rule, then makes his huge decision to adopt Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium as the official state religion.
And the choice of Byzantium was strategic.
Very much so, based on the sources. It wasn't just spiritual, it plugged Russes into a major cultural, political, and economic network. It brought Byzantine art, architecture, legal ideas, literature, and crucially, the Cyrillic script.
Which is essential for administration, for writing things down.
Totally. And it linked the ruler to divine authority, providing a model for centralized power based on the Byzantine example. A really deep integration.
And this continued after Vladimir.
Yes. Under Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century, you get this period often called the Golden Age of Kievan Rus's. Cultural achievements, think St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, the first law code, Ruskaya Pravda. Dynastic links to European royalty through marriage.
So Kievan Rus's was connected, it was thriving, but still dealing with that pressure from the steppe.
Always. That interaction with nomadic groups like the Pechenegs and Cumans, raids, wars, alliances, it was a constant. And internally, even during the Golden Age, rivalries between princes meant fragmentation was already setting in even before the Mongols arrived.
Ah, yes, the Mongols, a huge external shock.
Huge. Starting 1237, Batu Khan leads the invasion. The sources paint a picture of just utter devastation. City after city sacked, Ryazan Vladimir, culminating in the destruction of Kiev in 1240. That's really the end of Kievan Rus as a major power.
And this starts the period known as the Mongol Yoke.
Right, lasting roughly from 1240 to 1480. For over 2 centuries, the Russian principalities become tributaries to the Golden Horde. They weren't usually directly occupied, but they had to pay this heavy tribute.
Which must have crippled the economy.
It really did. Drained resources, hampered urban development in many places. But there's this historical debate, isn't there, about the long-term impact?
Yeah, was it purely destructive, or did it somehow pave the way for something else?
That's a key point in the material. While the devastation was undeniable, the process of collecting tribute for the Mongols, well, it ended up concentrating power in the hands of those princes who were good at managing that relationship with the horde.
And this is where Moscow comes in. It was a minor player before this.
Exactly. Moscow's princes, figures like Ivan Khalida, they became the chief tribute collectors. They cooperated with the Mongols.
Cooperated. That sounds counterintuitive.
Oh, it gave them authority over other Russian princes, acting as the horde's agents. It allowed them to gather wealth and consolidate land. So, ironically, this period of subjugation helps centralize power around Moscow.
Huh. And the church moved there too.
Yes. Critically, Moscow became the new center of the Russian Orthodox Church after Kiev's decline. That added enormous prestige and ideological weight.
So a foreign invasion ends up reinforcing that pattern of centralized power, just shifting the center.
It's a really compelling example of how external forces can shape internal development, and the figure who really brings this new power center into its own and throws off the yoke is Ivan III, Ivan the Great.
Okay, I'm the third, ruling late 15th century.
1462 to 1505. He essentially ends Mongol dominance. That standoff at the Ugar River in 1480 is often seen as the symbolic moment. He also vastly expanded Muscovite territory, tripled its size, bringing other Russian lands under his control.
And he started acting more like an absolute ruler.
Definitely. He adopts Byzantine symbols, calls himself sovereign by the grace of God, sets up the first central government offices, issues a new law code, the Sudebnik, and significantly introduces rules tying peasants more firmly to the land.
Laying the groundwork for serfdom.
A key step in that direction, yeah.
Yeah.
He really solidifies Moscow as the core of a new centralized Russian state.
Which then becomes a Tsardom under his grandson, Ivan IV.
Right. Crowned the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547. And that title, Tsar, from Caesar, is a very deliberate claim to supreme divinely ordained power, linking back symbolically to Byzantium and Rome.
He continued consolidating power, but, well, the nickname The Terrible suggests it wasn't smooth.
Not at all. His reign is known for incredible brutality, especially the Oprichnina period from 1565 to 1572.
What was the Oprichnina exactly? The sources mention it was controversial.
It was basically a state within a state territory ruled directly and brutally by Ivan through his personal agents, the Oprichniki. The goal seems to have been to crush the power of the traditional aristocracy, the boyars, through terror, executions, land confiscations.
They were.
It certainly weakened the boyars and centralized power in Ivan's hands, but at the cost of immense chaos, instability, and bloodshed. His reign ends in turmoil, leading directly into the time of troubles.
Ah, right. The period after the dynasty ends. Sounds bad.
It was terrible. 1598 to 1613, dynastic crises, civil wars, a devastating famine early on, and foreign intervention, particularly the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who even occupied Moscow for a time. The state almost collapsed entirely.
But it pulls through with the election of a new dynasty.
Yes, in 1613, a national assembly elects Michael Romanov as Tsar. This establishes the Romanov dynasty, which rules for the next 300 years and restores central authority after the chaos.
Okay, so the state is restored. The next really big transformer described is Peter the Great.
Absolutely fundamental figure. Peter, ruling from 1682 to 1725, he was just determined to modernize Russia, to westernize it, often by force.
How so?
He reformed the entire administration, created a modern standing army and navy based on European models, brought the Orthodox Church under state control via the Holy Synod, and, maybe most symbolically, built a brand new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic.
A window to Europe.
Exactly, a very deliberate move to orient Russia westward to make it a major European military and political power.
And then Catherine the Great follows, continuing some of that.
Yes, Catherine, ruling 1762-1796, often called the Golden Age of the Russian Empire. She admired the Enlightenment, corresponded with philosophers like Voltaire, continued Peter's westernizing trends in administration and culture.
But the material points out a big contradiction during her reign, right?
A major one. While she's talking Enlightenment ideals, she massively strengthens the power and privileges of the nobility. The charter to the gentry is key here, ending their mandatory service. And at the same time, she tightens the system of serfdom for the vast majority.
So liberal ideas at the top, but reinforcing traditional hierarchies and inequality below.
Precisely. It's a recurring tension. Top-down reform meets entrenched interests and social structures.
Her reign also saw a huge expansion, making Russia a dominant power.
Peak imperial expansion, really. Annexation of Crimea, large parts of Poland through the partitions, expansion along the Black Sea coast. Russia becomes undeniably a major European player.
Okay, moving into the 19th century. The empire seems to come under increasing stress.
Definitely. The autocratic system starts to buckle under modern pressures. You see the beginnings of revolutionary movements, first the populists, later the Marxists. Military setbacks, like the Crimean War in the 1850s, revealed weaknesses.
Even if the soldiers fought bravely.
Right. The sources mention that heroism, but also the state's shortcomings. And then there's industrialization, which Russia adopts later than Western Europe.
Creating new problems.
Big social and economic tensions. Rapid growth of cities, poor working conditions, vast inequality, widespread poverty, all feeding discontent. And serfdom hangs on until 1861.
The emancipation, that must have helped.
It was a monumental change, freeing millions. But the way it was done often left peasants indebted, with poor land, still tied to the commune. It didn't really solve the fundamental land and poverty issues. The old autocratic system just struggled to cope.
Leading to things like the 1905 revolution.
Yeah, often called the dress rehearsal for 1917. It was sparked by the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the Bloody Sunday Massacre. It really shook the regime.
And forced some changes, like the Duma.
Limited concessions, yes. The Duma, a kind of parliament, was created, moving towards a constitutional monarchy on paper. But Tsar Nicholas II never fully accepted limitations on his power, and the core problems weren't addressed.
And then the final blow, World War I.
The sources are really clear on this. WWI put an unbearable strain on the whole system. Military disasters, economic collapse, food shortages, logistical chaos, millions dead. It just destroyed public confidence in the Tsar and the government.
The war crisis became the immediate trigger for revolution.
Absolutely. It pushed everything over the edge.
So 1917, two revolutions that year.
First, the February Revolution, which was actually in March by our calendar. It starts with protests in Petrograd, women demanding bread and peace. Then workers go on strike.
And the crucial part was the soldiers joining in.
That was decisive. When the soldiers in the capital refused to fire on protesters and started joining them, the Tsar lost his power base. He was forced to abdicate. End of the Romanovs, end of the empire.
Just like that. Centuries of rule gone. What replaced it?
Well, that was the problem. You had this period of dual power. A provisional government formed by moderate politicians from the Duma tried to rule. But alongside them, you had the Soviets, these powerful councils of workers and soldiers, especially in the cities.
And the provisional government struggled.
Massively. They couldn't deliver on the big demands. Peace, land, and bread. Their biggest mistake, probably, was keeping Russia in World War I. That alienated huge numbers of people, soldiers especially.
Creating an opening for more radical groups.
Exactly. Fertile ground for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who had a clear, radical message. End the war, give land to the peasants, all power to the Soviets.
Which led to the October Revolution later that year.
Right. The Bolsheviks seized power, overthrowing the provisional government. This established the world's first socialist state, later the Soviet Union. The material stresses this as a truly radical break, attempting to completely remake society, economy, politics, even culture, based on Marxist ideology.
But this break wasn't accepted peacefully.
Not at all. It immediately triggered a devastating civil war, lasting from about 1918 to 1922. The Bolshevik Red Army fought against various anti-communist white armies, plus nationalist groups, and even foreign powers intervened.
And the Reds won.
They did, consolidating Bolshevik control, but the country was absolutely wrecked.
And out of this chaos emerges Joseph Stalin.
Yes. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin gradually outmaneuvered rivals and became the undisputed dictator by about 1929. His era, until his death in 1953, brought another wave of profound and brutal transformation.
This is the era of the 5-year plans.
Starting in 1928, a crash program of state-controlled centralized economic planning aimed at rapid industrialization. Huge focus on heavy industry, military production.
And collectivization of agriculture.
At the same time, forcing peasants off their private land onto massive state-controlled collective farms, eliminating private property in the countryside.
The human cost described in the sources is staggering.
Unimaginable. Industrial output soared, yes, but collectivization led to chaos, resistance, and catastrophic famine, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions died.
And this was alongside intense political repression.
Pervasive terror. The Great Purge, starting around 1934, targeted perceived enemies everywhere within the party, the military, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. Millions were executed or died in the Gulag system.
Gulag.
Yeah.
The labor camps.
A vast network. Forced labor was a key part of the industrialization drive, but at a horrific human price. Stalin's rule meant total state control, enforced through absolute terror, fostering this idea of constant struggle against enemies, internal and external.
And then came the ultimate external struggle, World War II.
The German invasion, June 1941. The Eastern Front became the mainland theater of the war in Europe, just unbelievably brutal and vast. Germany made huge initial gains.
But the Soviets held on, turned the tide. Stalingrad, Kursk.
Those were the pivotal turning points, yes. Immense bloody battles that reversed the German advance. But the sources emphasized the nature of the Nazi war in the East. It was explicitly a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation.
Driven by racist ideology.
Viewing Slavs as subhuman. So Nazi policies involved scorched earth, mass deportations, deliberate starvation, massacres of civilians on an industrial scale. The Holocaust against Jews was part of this broader genocidal violence.
Millions of civilians died, not just soldiers.
Millions perished from starvation, disease, forced labor, mass executions, and the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was appalling. The source suggests maybe 60% of those captured died in Nazi hands.
Yet, despite these unimaginable losses,
the Soviet Union, allied with Britain and the U.S., eventually pushed the Germans back and took Berlin in May 1945. But the cost, estimates range from 20 to 27 million Soviet lives lost, the highest of any country.
the war devastated the country but also left the USSR a superpower.
Exactly. It emerged with huge military power, control over Eastern Europe, and entered straight into the Cold War with the United States. Ideological conflict, communism versus capitalism.
And Soviet policy was driven by this.
Completely. Aiming to spread communism, counter American influence, support anti-colonial movements, they saw U.S. actions through an intensely ideological, hostile lens.
A global competition.
In everything. Military buildup, proxy wars, but also science, the space race, Sputnik, Gagarin culture, sports. Moments of extreme tension, too, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
After Stalin died in 1953, things changed a bit. De-Stalinization.
Under Nikita Khrushchev, 1953-1964, it's known as the Khrushchev Thaw. He famously denounced Stalin's crimes in the secret speech in 1956.
What did that mean, practically?
Some easing of censorship, release of many political prisoners from the gulags, slightly more open cultural life, attempts to raise living standards, a limited liberalization, but significant after Stalin.
But Khrushchev didn't last.
No, he was ousted in 1964. Succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev, whose rule, 1964-1982, is often called the era of stagnation.
Stagnation. Sounds like things slowed down.
Politically, it was very stable, maybe rigid, but the economy really started to lag in the 1970s. Innovation slowed, living standards didn't keep pace with the West, corruption increased. And that reliance on exporting oil and gas became even more pronounced, another echo of earlier patterns.
So by the 1980s, the system was in trouble.
Deep trouble. Economic weakness, political sclerosis. It was clear major reforms were needed.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985.
Right. He inherited this stagnant system and tried to reform it with perestroika economic restructuring and glasnost openness, allowing more public discussion.
Trying to revitalize the system.
That was the intention. But the sources make it clear these reforms had massive unintended consequences. They weakened the Communist Party's grip and the central planning system without quickly creating effective replacements.
And glasnost opened Pandora's box.
In a way, yes. It allowed long-suppressed grievances, especially ethnic and nationalist feelings, to come pouring out. Republics within the USSR started pushing for more autonomy than sovereignty.
The economy didn't improve quickly enough either.
No, things actually got worse initially. Shortages, declining output, growing deficits. Central control was weakening, republics were holding back taxes. It became unclear who was really in charge. Gorbachev sort of lost control of the process he started.
And then the hardliners tried to turn back the clock with the coup attempt.
August 1991, that failed coup attempt was the final blow. It destroyed Gorbachev's authority and massively boosted Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, who had stood up to the coup plotters.
After that, the breakup was rapid.
A cascade. The Baltic states were already gone, then Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for independence in December 1991. That really sealed the fate of the USSR. Yeltsin wasn't interested in a union without Ukraine.
So the end came quickly.
Gorbachev resigned on Christmas Day, 1991. A few days later, the leaders of the remaining republics formally dissolved the Soviet Union. It officially ceased to exist on December 31st. Another huge discontinuity.
Leading to the birth of the Russian Federation.
Yes, Russia emerged as the main successor state, taking the UN Security Council seat, the nuclear arsenal. The early years under Yeltsin were, well, chaotic.
That shock therapy economic reform.
A rapid, painful shift towards a market economy. It led to hyperinflation, economic collapse for many, the rise of incredibly wealthy oligarchs who grabbed state assets, real hardship, plus political instability, the 1993 constitutional crisis, the brutal wars in Chechnya.
Which sets the stage for the Putin era, starting around 2000.
Characterized by a strong re-centralization of power after the turbulence of the 90s, often described as managed democracy. The forms are there, but state control is tight.
What does that look like in practice?
Suppression of independent media, constraints on civil society, crackdowns on protests, imprisonment of opposition figures. Constitutional changes have also allowed for extended rule.
And the economy. Still reliant on resources.
Very much so. Oil and gas remain crucial, making the economy vulnerable to global prices and sanctions. It's that persistent pattern again. The sources also mention ongoing demographic issues, low birth rates, and environmental problems.
And foreign policy has become more assertive.
Definitely. Ideas like sovereign democracy, asserting Russia's interests in its perceived sphere of influence. We've seen this in actions regarding Georgia in 2008, and especially Ukraine since 2014, culminating in the 2022 invasion. Internally, there's this ongoing process of nation-building, defining Russian identity, sometimes drawing on both Tsarist and Soviet legacies. So when you look at all this material, this huge sweep of history, it's definitely not a simple story, is it? It's constantly shaped by that immense geography, hit by these massive external shocks, Mongols, World War II, and driven by these internal struggles over power, identity, modernization.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see these patterns repeating, like you said. That drive for strong central control, the state playing such a dominant role in the economy, the sheer challenge of the geography, that push-pull between westernizing and having a distinct identity, the tendency toward expansion.
Exactly. They keep surfacing, adapting maybe, but they're there, even after huge breaks like 1917 or 1991.
And understanding those deep currents, that's really key, isn't it? It's not just about the dates and names. It helps put today's Russia, its politics, its economy, its actions, into a much richer context.